The lessons that weren't written down. November 19th, 1945, Fort Huachuca, Arizona. The desert was quiet in a way that made men uneasy. No wind, no birds, just the crunch of boots on gravel and the slow creak of leather straps tightening in the cold dawn air. A line of U.S. Army officers stood at the edge of a dry wash, clipboards tucked under their arms, eyes scanning the broken terrain ahead. The war in Europe was over. The Pacific had gone silent. Yet here, in the Arizona desert, the Army was still watching, still learning. "Watch your spacing," a sergeant muttered. "Too loud," another whispered. They weren't watching recruits. They were watching instructors. 3 men moved across the wash ahead of them, slow, deliberate, almost careless in appearance. No standard formation, no hand signals, no obvious pattern. And yet every step avoided loose stone, every pause aligned with shadow, every movement blended into the land so completely that the men seemed to belong to it. One officer frowned. "This isn't in the manual," he said. The man beside him didn't answer. He had already seen this kind of movement before, years earlier, in Italy, in the Philippines, in the jungles where patrols vanished and reappeared without ever being heard. The techniques weren't new. They were old, and the Army was about to quietly make them its own. Long before Fort Huachuca hosted post-war training experiments, Apache men had been moving through terrain in ways that defied European military logic. They didn't advance, they didn't hold ground, they read it. During World War II, a small number of Apache soldiers served as scouts, guides, and instructors, rarely labeled as such in official records. They were assigned to reconnaissance elements, security patrols, and training roles where silence, patience, and terrain awareness mattered more than firepower. What they brought with them wasn't doctrine, it was instinct refined into discipline. Italy, 1944. An American infantry patrol stalled at the edge of a wooded ridgeline. German positions were somewhere ahead, known only by the absence of sound and the uneasy feeling that someone else was already watching. A young Apache scout, his name never recorded in the after-action report, crouched, touched the ground, and waited. He didn't look for footprints, he listened, not for movement, but for stillness where there shouldn't have been any. He redirected the patrol 30 yards to the left. Minutes later, German fire tore through the space they would have occupied. The report credited excellent reconnaissance judgment, nothing more. By 1945, officers returning from combat zones shared a common realization. Modern warfare had not erased the value of ancient skills, it had amplified them. After the war, as the U.S. military reorganized, something unusual began to happen. New training programs emerged, reconnaissance schools, ranger concepts, long-range patrol doctrines. The language was modern, the diagrams were crisp, the terminology was technical, but the movement felt different. Instructors began emphasizing things that hadn't mattered before the war, walking around noise instead of through it, using broken terrain instead of cover, letting formations dissolve and reform naturally, navigating without visible references. These ideas weren't credited to any tribe. They weren't credited to anyone at all. They were labeled adaptive fieldcraft. At Fort Huachuca, one Apache instructor demonstrated how to cross open ground without signaling intent. He didn't crouch, he didn't rush, he moved at a pace that matched the environment, pausing only when the land itself suggested it. One officer scribbled notes, another shook his head in disbelief. "That wouldn't work in combat," someone muttered. The instructor stopped, turned, and pointed to a set of faint impressions in the dirt, boot marks none of the officers had noticed. "You're already being watched," he said calmly. The silence that followed was heavy. No official memo ever stated that Apache methods were being absorbed into U.S. doctrine. No citation appeared in post-war manuals. Instead, the techniques were stripped of origin, renamed, and systematized. What had once been lived knowledge became procedure. And in the process, the people who had perfected it over generations quietly vanished from the narrative. But the techniques remained. They would surface again in jungles, deserts, and mountains, taught to soldiers who never knew where they came from, only that they worked. And that was exactly how the Army preferred it.
When instinct became doctrine. March 4th, 1947, Fort Benning, Georgia. Rain slicked the red clay until it shone like wet brick. The training ground was quiet except for the hiss of drizzle on leaves and the soft scuff of boots. A class of young officers waited at the tree line, rifles slung, helmets tilted forward. They had been told to observe, not to interfere, not to ask questions. Across the clearing, an instructor stepped out alone. He didn't address the class. He didn't call them to attention. He simply walked, slowly, into the woods. Minutes passed. Someone shifted. Another officer cleared his throat. The instructor was gone. Then a voice spoke from behind them. "Now you move." The class jolted. Heads snapped around. The instructor stood 10 yards back, dry despite the rain, boots clean, eyes calm. No one had seen him circle. No one had heard him pass. The lesson wasn't written on the board. It was written in the air. What the Army was teaching now had a name, fieldcraft, integration, but it was built from older bones. The post-war Army was obsessed with modernization, new weapons, new radios, new vehicles. But alongside that push ran a quieter current, the recognition that technology had limits. Radios failed, vehicles bogged down, maps lied, and when all of that happened, soldiers still had to move, hide, and survive. The instructors who shaped the new recon courses drew from wartime experience. Some had fought in Italy's mountains, others in the Pacific's jungles. A few had trained alongside Apache scouts, men who never lectured, never explained, but showed. So the Army began translating instinct into instruction. They broke movement into principles. Noise discipline wasn't just silence, it was predictability avoidance. Concealment wasn't hiding behind cover, it was becoming expected. Navigation wasn't following lines, it was understanding ground intention. The language was clinical, the essence was not. Korea, 1951. Frozen hills, wind like a blade, patrols moving at night with breath freezing in their scarves. In these conditions, European-style formations failed. The land punished straight lines and rigid spacing. A platoon leader trained in the new recon doctrine ordered his men to break formation without command. No shouted orders, no whistles, just a hand lowering, a pace slowing, a collective understanding. They moved like water finding cracks. Chinese forces watched them pass and never realized they had been seen first. After-action reports praised innovative dispersion techniques and terrain-adaptive movement. The words were new, the movement was not. Back in the United States, manuals were revised again. One chapter emphasized terrain reading, not map reading, but sensing slope, drainage, vegetation stress, and animal paths. Soldiers were taught to notice where dew lingered longer, where birds avoided landing, where grass bent against the wind instead of with it. No instructor called it Apache knowledge, but a few late at night admitted where they had learned it. Vietnam, early 1960s. Jungle swallowed sound, visibility collapsed to yards. American patrols struggled until a familiar pattern emerged. Long-range recon patrols abandoned rigid formations. They learned to move when cicadas screamed, to stop when insects went silent. They stopped cutting trails. They stepped around foliage instead of through it. Training pamphlets credited adaptive jungle doctrine. Veterans knew better. One sergeant asked why his patrol never triggered ambushes, shrugged. He said, "We don't fight the jungle, we let it carry us." That sentence never made it into the manual. The erasure wasn't malicious, it was institutional. The Army didn't steal so much as absorb. Techniques were stripped of story, origin, and context, then rebuilt as neutral, universal principles. That process made them portable, teachable, scalable, but it also made them anonymous. The Apache instructors who would quietly influence these methods faded into footnotes, if they appeared at all. Some returned to reservations, some stayed on as civil trainers, unnamed, others vanished from the record entirely. Their legacy lived on in every patrol that crossed ground without leaving a trace. Fort Huachuca, 1954. A new class watched an instructor demonstrate movement across open desert. No crawling, no sprinting, just a steady pace that matched the land's rhythm. An officer asked, "What's the rule for that?" The instructor paused, considering. "There isn't one. You listen first." The officer frowned, then wrote something anyway. By the time the notes became doctrine, the sentence would read, "Movement should adapt dynamically to environmental cues. Clean, efficient, empty of origin, but effective." By the mid-1950s, the transformation was complete. Apache methods, once dismissed as primitive or outdated, had been reborn as modern reconnaissance science. They were taught in classrooms, tested on ranges, and praised in reports. No one called them Apache tactics anymore. They were simply called best practice. And that was the quiet victory. Skills honed over generations, surviving not as memory, but as motion, passed hand to hand, bootstep to bootstep, across a military that never fully acknowledged where it learned to move.
The silence that outlived the war. October 1962, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The briefing room smelled of chalk dust and coffee gone cold. A projector hummed softly as black and white slides flickered against the wall. Grainy images of soldiers moving through forests, deserts, and mountains. Arrows showed paths. Circles marked pauses. Nothing in the diagrams suggested where these ideas had come from. "Notice the spacing," the instructor said. "No fixed intervals. The terrain decides." A captain raised his hand. "Sir, this looks unconventional." The instructor nodded once. "It works." That was the end of the discussion. By now, the methods born from Apache fieldcraft had become so deeply embedded that questioning them felt pointless. They were no longer borrowed. They were assumed. They were simply the way competent soldiers moved when they didn't want to die. In the decades after World War II, the U.S. military faced conflicts where technology alone could not guarantee dominance. Korea, Vietnam, countless advisory missions in unfamiliar terrain. Each war reinforced the same lesson. Firepower meant nothing if you were seen first. And so the quiet inheritance continued. Special Forces training emphasized environmental patience, the ability to wait without signaling presence. Ranger courses drilled soldiers to move without compressing vegetation. Recon units learned to identify negative space, places where the absence of sound or movement meant danger. None of this came with footnotes. The Apache contribution had dissolved into the bloodstream of doctrine. Vietnam Highlands, 1968. A 6-man reconnaissance team halted along a ridgeline. The jungle below was alive with sound. Birds, insects, distant water. Too alive. The team leader raised a fist. Everyone froze. He crouched, touched the soil, then shifted the patrol 20 meters downslope without explanation. Minutes later, North Vietnamese troops crossed the exact spot the Americans had avoided. After the mission, the report credited experienced intuition. No one asked where that intuition came from. Back home, military historians struggled with a problem they didn't fully recognize. They could trace weapons development, they could document tactical manuals, but skills passed person to person left no paper trail. Apache veterans who had served as scouts or instructors rarely wrote memoirs. Many never spoke publicly. Their contributions were absorbed without ceremony, then forgotten as individual acts. The Army didn't erase them out of hostility. It erased them through standardization. Once something worked, it became policy. Once it became policy, its origins stopped mattering. Arizona, early 1970s.
An elderly Apache man watched a group of soldiers training in the desert, moving slowly, reading ground, pausing where the land paused. A reporter asked him what he thought. He smiled faintly. "They finally learned to walk," he said. That quote never ran. By the late 19th century, the techniques had spread beyond the army. Law enforcement trackers, search and rescue teams, border patrol units, all learned variations of the same principles. Don't impose yourself on the land. Listen to it. The words changed. The methods endured. Somewhere along the way, the Apache name disappeared from the conversation entirely. But every soldier who moved unseen through hostile terrain carried that legacy in their footsteps, whether they knew it or not. And that might have been the final irony. The Apache approach to war had never been about recognition. It had always been about survival. The U.S. military learned that lesson late and kept it quietly.
What remained after the credit was gone? Present day, Fort Huachuca, Arizona. The desert looks unchanged, the same broken washes, the same scrub and stone, the same silence that once unnerved officers watching Apache instructors move across open ground without leaving a sign. Modern soldiers train here now. Their gear is different. Digital radios, lightweight armor, satellite navigation. But when they step off the road and into the land, something older takes over. They slow without being told. They avoid skyline exposure instinctively. They choose paths that feel right before they can explain why. No one says Apache during the briefings. The doctrine calls it terrain dominance. The instructors call it situational awareness. The manuals describe it as adaptive movement under observation threat. Different words, same behavior. In archives, the paper trail ends early. World War II reports mention scouts, guides, and instructors without detail. Names are omitted, backgrounds flattened into rank and unit numbers. The Army's need for efficiency had stripped identity from skill. What survived was the method, and methods once learned are hard to unlearn. A special forces candidate crawls through brush during a final exercise. He doesn't cut a path. He steps where the ground has already yielded. He waits until insects return to their rhythm before moving again. When he passes the test, the instructor nods. "Good fieldcraft," he says. No citation, no history lesson, just approval. The Apache influence lives in places no metal can reach, in the pause before movement, in the angle of a step, in the decision not to be seen rather than to fight. That influence crossed generations of conflict without being named, because naming it would have complicated the narrative of modern warfare. But complexity doesn't vanish just because it's ignored. In quiet moments, some instructors still tell the truth, not in classrooms, not on record, but over coffee, or in the field when no one is listening. They'll say things like, "This isn't ours. We learned this from people who never wrote manuals." Then they move on. The Apache tactics were never copied in a single act. They weren't stolen or claimed outright. They were absorbed, filtered through war, reformatted into doctrine, and passed down without attribution. And in that sense, they achieved something rare. They survived. Not as myth, not as legend, but as muscle memory in soldiers who will never know whose footsteps they're following. The war ended, the manuals changed, the names faded, but the land still recognizes those who know how to move through it.